It is a pleasure for me to be here, and there's a particular reason that I chose to accept the invitation, because in a very real sense it was CII which set me on a path to an interest in energy, because a very long time ago, I think it must have been 20 years ago when I was still at NCAR, Tadan Das asked me to do some thinking on resource security for CII, and I submitted a paper at that time, and that then led to an interest in energy, interactions with the Planning Commission, and then the offer to join Royal Dutch Shell. And so this is an issue of considerable interest to me, but in a fast-changing economic environment. I was asked to give a keynote speaker. Give a keynote speech. I come from NITI Ayog, which now has responsibility for assisting Honorable Prime Minister in thinking about the Viksit Bharat goal in a fast-changing global environment. Energy is at the center of it. We've heard a lot already about the present state of play and what some of the challenges are. I'll start by repeating some of those or returning to some of those in against the context of what NITI Ayog itself is doing. But then I do want to enter into a slightly more speculative zone, partly animated by my 4 years as chief economist of Shell and the exposure to thinking long term as oil companies do. So we have already heard that India is embarking on a historic, perhaps unique journey to become a developed economy by 2040, developed society, I should say. A developed economy is a means to an end. The goal of the Prime Minister is a developed society. And, NITI Ayog has its role, but let me just say here that Prime Minister sees our task as being mass mobilization of the society in the way that, as he puts it, the freedom struggle came about in 25 years as a consequence of mass mobilization by Gandhiji. So this is really a question of getting, as it were, the whole society to own the task that we need to be and we can be, and we owe it to ourselves to be a developed society in the next 22 years now. Industrialized nations grew on fossil fuels, but India must, I wouldn't say leapfrog, but India has different options and different choices. I do want to point out here that in the year of 2015, just 1 year after Honorable Prime Minister took office, India, under his leadership, signed on to the Paris Agreement, and I think it's fair to say that this was to some extent in the face of what the advice was or the position was of government, and it also signed up to something that NITI Ayog is responsible for, which is the Sustainable Development Goals. And I do want to reinforce what the Joint Secretary from the Ministry of Economic Affairs has said, which is that, and this was reinforced in our G20 presidency, that India's commitment to the Paris Agreement, to the climate goals, comes from the Prime Minister, and we know that we are possible aspirants to host the so-called COP, the Conference of Parties, in a couple of years' time. So I think it is unfair and incorrect for India's, as it were, green credentials to be, as it were, put under scrutiny. I'll return to this in a little bit. But this has to be reconciled with the Viksit Bharat goals. And I think as all of us take the message out, we need to stress to the rest of the world the audaciousness and boldness of the challenge that India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Modi, has taken on. Because these are, at the end of the day, new, untested technologies at scale in many ways. I'm talking about solar, wind, etc. Everybody else has developed without care for the environment. We are trying to be prudent custodians of the environment. But as was said, it is our national self-interest that has to determine our energy policies. But that self-interest, both diplomatic and technical, will be determined in a fast-moving global environment and to some extent technological environment. But here I do want to share a slogan that was used at Shell. By the way, it's a long time since I left Shell, 2016. But I think the phrase or the slogan that was used then remains relevant. They said that where the world will be in 30 years is not so much about breakthrough technologies, but about technologies breaking through. And so it is to build on, in the way that China is doing, technologies which already exist, be it hydrogen, be it wind, be it solar, but going down the cost curve, developing them at scale, that is really going to be the secret of the kind of blend of fossil and non-fossil that we should be aiming for. I won't go over, in the interest of time, all the numbers about the enormous increase in scale of our energy demand, but the one point I would stress, because it has in its own way come up in the earlier remarks, is that there are these two quite different concepts of energy security. There is energy security as a diplomatic challenge, ensuring that you are not disadvantaged because of the actions of others. You have choices. But very importantly, energy security is also an issue at the micro level. Maybe a better term for that is energy access. This government has had tremendous success, particularly in electrification. But linked up with this is very much the issue of energy affordability. And so, as we progress, we must make sure that we don't trap ourselves into a high-cost energy system which cuts off access. So there's not only the challenge of, as it were, building out to scale relatively new technologies, but there's also the challenge of, for the interests of our industrial competitiveness, but also in order to encourage the use of electricity, trying to keep this competitive. So let me now, as it were, shift a little bit to the longer term, the role of NITI, and some of the issues that, as a keynote speaker, I'd like to put before you for the rest of the discussion. So there was a set of doctrines at a time when renewables were just a small part, hydro basically, of our energy mix, particularly our electricity mix, and where the question really was assured supply of hydrocarbons. The contribution that I made to CII in 2007, 2008, which then led to my being a member of the Task Force on National Security, again on resource security, was to say, look, because that was a time when China was going around snapping up, as it is doing even today, it's doing today with critical minerals. At that time it was snapping up hydrocarbon resources around the world. And I argued at that time that it wasn't obvious that owning sort of acreage in South Sudan, which is one of the things we did, was necessarily adding to our energy security. And I therefore, came up with two doctrines saying that we should model ourselves less on China, but more on the United States. In what ways? Firstly, and of course this was before the United States itself became the biggest producer of oil and gas in the world, when it was still dependent on OPEC, and it's a sign of how much does and can change in 15 years. So the United States basically did two things, which I think India could learn from. It certainly had clear energy security goals, but by means that were never entirely transparent. Those goals were entrusted to Exxon, Chevron, Shell. Now we are, blessed by some very sophisticated private sector players. And so the question of whether achieving our energy security goals, or what mix of private sector players and what is the reality today, largely government by government, PSU dominated, I think is an issue that is worth thinking about in a 15-year kind of framework. I don't know whether that increases our security, decreases our security, but I think that as we're seeing now with commercial banks, banks that were nationalized in the 1970s, now there's a new wave of foreign investment. So I'm just saying that the industrial structure of our hydrocarbon sector is something that we need to look at. As you know, we got to where we were with the oil majors, essentially through the nationalization of the multinationals, Burma Shell, Exxon, Esso, and Caltex in the early 70s. That's 50 years ago, and so looking at whether that structure is the right structure for us to assure our energy security needs thinking about, and I don't know who would do that thinking. I know we at NITI are not thinking about it, but maybe, as you think about energy security, that could be an element in your thinking. So the first question is, how do market economies ensure energy security? And it's a mixture. So France has had Total, and I'm talking about hydrocarbons now. Britain went with BP. The US never had a national oil company, and so what the mix between national and private in exploration, we know that Vedanta, and before that, that there were in exploration there were private sector, and there are private sector, and BP is also present here. But let me not labor the point. The second point that I wanted to make was the big shift of the second point I wanted to make, still in hydrocarbons, is how we should define energy security. I had 3 months sitting in the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., reading how Americans had defined energy security in their own context. And at that time, they basically were talking of limitations in the supply of energy which could less about defense, which could interrupt economic activity. Now, the world has now weaponized economic relations, but I think the point remains relevant that the evidence at that time was many of the interruptions of energy supply on record were not because of things like the oil embargo, but they were because of interruptions in the supply of domestic energy. So it could be trade unions, it could be seismic issues, it could be typhoons. And so to say that because we've got large coal deposits, never mind that we will be, as it were, pilloried for using those coal deposits, that the fact that they are there is not an adequate guarantee of energy security. So the doctrine of energy security that I think should guide us is sufficient diversification between fuel sources, but fuel types and fuel sources, so that we always have a plan B. And again, the question of whether this is the responsibility of PPAC, whether it's a responsibility of NITI Ayog, PMO, I think is a little sort of unclear at the moment. Up till now, I've been talking about the concepts of energy security as they apply to the traditional hydrocarbons. I returned to India from the World Bank in 2001, and it so happened that my predecessor, Rakesh Mohan, had received a contract to work on a first draft of the energy bill, which was being prepared by Gajendra Haldia at NCAR, which then became the Energy Act, and of course it's been through recent revisions as well. Now, at that time, frankly, electricity was entirely a public sector activity. Distribution, transmission, generation, these were all PSUs. And there were a lot of inefficiency, but it was all masked by this being what I might call a consenting adults kind of business. So from then, 2001 to now, firstly, we brought merchant power, merchant operators into the generation system. A little bit in distribution, not at all perhaps in transmission. But the second point I want to make is that as we move from, hydrocarbons as the basis for electrification to renewables as a source of electrification, we have a very different, as it were, investment structure and a very different financing structure, and of course a very different as it were, delivery structure. So all the renewables players, to begin with, were in the private sector. And there, if you like, credibility of policy matters so much more than when it was PSU hydrocarbons that were the backbone of our electricity generation. And so I wanted to make the point that really the challenges of both energy security, the challenges of energy security as renewables start to play an increasingly important but not exclusive role. I'm in full agreement that you are going to need hydrocarbons and coal for some time to come. That poses new challenges for energy security. And those challenges are what are the reason for the Ministry of Mines being a sponsor this time of this energy security discussion, because we now know that critical minerals are important for renewables, for batteries, and there is less diversification than we enjoyed with both coal and oil and gas. Now, it's true that these are at the initial stage of installational stage. They're not a recurrent drain in the way that our foreign exchange expenditure on oil and gas is, but that's still something to think about. And I don't know that Europe, the United States, or India have fully thought through how to manage those vulnerabilities while retaining cost competitiveness. Because just across the border, we can see in Pakistan, in a country, and indeed in Brazil, countries which have had no hang-ups about sourcing the cheapest sources of solar modules, which are Chinese. I mean, they have been able to proceed much more quickly on rooftop solar in the case of Pakistan, EVs in the case of Brazil, than our attempt to have multiple goals in the energy transition. So, under the Biden administration, the US attempted to come up with this framework, this doctrine of small yard, high fence. Europe, for trying to define where they would benefit from the lowest sources of supply. I don't think they were terribly successful. And, you know, it has to be said that economic interdependence is being more strategically used than we had been used to. So, you know, these are reasons why, you know, these issues belong in the bailiwick of MEA, but there was reference made to the application by India for full membership of the IEA, even though we are not members of the OECD, and it's been my privilege. I was asked to represent India at the ministerial where the application was formally accepted, and this has been one of many contexts in which NITI Ayog has been working with the Economic Relations Secretary of MEA. I wildly exceeded my time. Oh goodness, have I? But I just wanted to say that energy security for the fastest growing member of the G20, the third largest economy by the end of the decade, is a major challenge. It will ask us to explore opportunities and alternatives that may have not occurred to us before. This session would rightly focus on, or this meeting will focus on the here and now, making sure that we make the investments that are necessary to ensure uninterrupted supply. I'm sorry I can't stay with the rest of the discussion, but let me again thank CII for giving me the opportunity to return to the platform that set me on a almost 20-year journey, and I wish the event the best of luck.